Janice.
Welcome. Good evening. Welcome to the Orange County Historical Society. Thank you all for coming this evening. I see so many old friends and familiar faces here, and some new faces too. So welcome to all of you, and a special big welcome to those of you who have not been to the Orange County Historical Society before. We've been doing this for 103 years, and intend to keep at it for a good while longer. So, a few announcements here and points of business before we get to our program. One, someone left a phone up by the check-in desk. Oh, I see a hand went up. Now, can you describe where the cracks on the screen are?
Belongs to my husband.
All right. Also, wanted to mention that we do have this evening our speaker tonight has her book here for sale, and there are also she also has a stack of posters about sun-kissed citrus throughout California, and those are free. Her gift to you, so you can't beat that. So thank you for that. Also, if you're interested, if you've missed any back issues of our publications, Lynn at the back table there can help you out with those. She has those for sale. Also, we're going to have this back there. This is something we're going back to doing, which is, this is a binder full of the different newsletters sent to us by other historical societies throughout Orange County, mostly the different city historical societies. So if you want to thumb through this after the meeting and see what everybody else is up to, that's there too. We have, I kind of wanted to rattle off some of our upcoming monthly programs so you know what to expect. Next month on the 14th, we have Manny Escamilla, an old friend of ours. He's going to be speaking about Professor Schiffer Goldman, who's of Santa Ana College, who is known as the godmother of Chicano and Hispanic Latin American art, murals specifically. She is the first to really study it, these forms of art academically, and everyone else has kind of jumped off where she started or built on that. So that should be really interesting. Actually, I know it's interesting because I went to him giving a talk on that earlier. In May, Amin Nash will be speaking on the story of Anaheim's Little Arabia. So there's a topic that we have not broached before, and I'm looking forward to learning more about that. In June, on June 9th, we have our annual dinner. It will be held at the Villa in Orange. And I've almost got the program pinned down for that. Just think arts. Just think arts. Art history in Orange County. So there'll be a connection. In September 8th, Steve Leck, who I kind of describe as the Phil Brigandy of Riverside County. But he's going to be talking about the Ortega Highway and its development and history. October 13th, we have Historic Cemeteries of Orange County, which will be a panel discussion with a number of experts from throughout the county. In November, we're going to try to revive Authors Night. We haven't done that for a while, and a good opportunity to see some of the different authors that have been working on local history in the last few years, and have them come and tell us something about their books and sell and sign, and it's always a fun evening. In December, Richard Hartman will be talking about Company L, Santa Ana's National Guard company, and their service at the Mexican border and during World War I. In January, yes, I'm going long on this, Robert David Brenton will be discussing the early development of Mission Viejo, followed in February by Mike Stockstill, who's been doing fantastic research, because he's been doing some of it at the county archives, and I see what good work he's doing, on the history of the Irvine Ranch. So, I just want to mention, people ask how our programs come to be, how we end up with the programs we have. Obviously suggestions from members come into play, sitting around brainstorming. Sometimes you notice a new book, and like I mentioned, I see people doing research, and I say, hey, you think there's a program in that? And then, of course, stealing great ideas from other groups. I'm not above that. But no matter how good the idea is, if there isn't an expert speaker to go with that topic, we kind of can't do it. So sometimes people say, well, why have you never had somebody come and give a talk on the ranchos of Orange County? I say, well, that's a fantastic idea. I would love that. But I don't know anybody who's up on that topic to the extent that they could give a whole talk up here for 45 minutes or what have you. For some topics, there isn't enough information available, period, to fill out the whole program. It may be a few very interesting facts we know, but there isn't anything else. For many of our speakers, it takes months, even years, to pull together all of the knowledge they need to have to be able to put together one of these presentations. So the idea of just throwing a topic to someone and saying do it isn't really an option. So in short, if you have suggestions for speakers for future programs or other events, please do share, come up and talk to me or one of the other board members. If there's a topic we wish, and if there is still a topic you wish we would cover that we haven't, and we kind of shrug and go, we don't know who's going to do that, now's your chance to buckle down, start doing your research, and you may be our next speaker. So just keep that in mind. So, I also want to mention we have on April 23rd, we have our spring history hike is coming up. That's going to be at Weir Canyon. So we're going to host a historical hike. It's led by historian Eric Plunkett through the hills above Orange and Anaheim. This land was once home to an Indian village. It was traveled by the Caros of the Yorba and Peralta ranchos, and was possibly used as a hideout by bandits. Eric will be interpreting the village archaeological site. We'll be talking about the missionization of the Indians there, the rise of the Rancho and American eras, and how that was reflected in the land there, and the days of the bandit gangs. And he'll talk about the story of Juan Flores' capture there at the mouth of the canyon. So a little swashbuckle thrown in. This is a 2.5 mile, 1.5 to 2 hour hike with an elevation gain of about 600 feet and some steep sections with loose dirt, so plan accordingly. Currently, it is only open to society members. However, sometime next month, if there are still spaces available, we'll open it to non-members as well. So, speaking of which, if you want to get in early and you're not a member, Lynn can also help you with your membership. So, with that, I want to introduce our speaker tonight. Janice Munemitsu is a third-generation Japanese-American Sansei. A native of Orange County, Janice worked on the family farm from age 5 through high school. She's a graduate of USC and Biola University. She's also the author of a new book, The Kindness of Color, the story of two families, and Mendez et al. V. Westminster, the 1947 desegregation of California public schools. With that, Janice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming tonight and for your interest in this story. This is a picture of myself and Sylvia the day I took her the first book. And Sylvia Mendez is the daughter of Felicitas and Gonzalo, who I'll talk more about that. But the reason I call it The Kindness of Color is when we've been places, we've been to New Jersey and New York, and she's spoken all over the U.S., but when we've talked about our family stories, that's what people were so interested in. And they're just kind of like, well, okay, you know. But what was interesting is at every critical point in our story, there was a kindness by a family member, a friend, or a stranger. And so the reason I call it the kindness of color is as we go through here, I'll point out a few of those. And in the book, I pointed out probably about 40 or 50 specific kindnesses that made this story possible. You've probably seen Gonzalo and Felicitas Mendez before, but this is my grandparents, Sema and Masako Munemitsu. So Gonzalo and Felicitas, she came from Puerto Rico as a young child. Gonzalo came from Mexico. And my grandparents both came from Japan. Now my grandfather was here from 1916. He came with his father, and they worked on the Carson Ranch, which is down in the Carson, Torrance, South Bay area. He went back to Japan to court my grandmother, and they came as newlyweds in 1921. Starting out farming at or working on the Carson Ranch farm for someone else, but then obviously moving to Westminster. Mr. Mendez met Felicitas through her father. He saw this hardworking guy and said, "Come on over for dinner." And so that's where he met his wife. They also worked in farming for a brief time, but then after they got married, as very young entrepreneurs in their mid-20s, they opened up a cantina in Santa Ana and were very successful restaurateurs there. So here is a picture of our family farm in Westminster. The barn, the family house, it also had some workers' cottages on it. And my grandfather was able to lease this from an older woman who saw, I guess, a lot of potential and thought they would take good care of it. And so my grandfather moved the family. At this time, he had two sons, my dad, Tad, and my uncle, Salo. And they moved to this farm. Here's a picture of my dad and his brother in overalls. My grandmother's in the back and another family relative with her young son. But you can kind of see the workers' cottages in the background to your right. And my dad also graduated from Huntington Beach High School. So there might be a few of you Huntington Beach Oilers out there, or people who know of Huntington Beach High. And that's his graduation picture. To tell you a little bit more about my dad, his real name was Seiko Lincoln Munemitsu. And he was known as Tad his whole life, so that's how most people refer to him. But interestingly, he has not only just an English middle name, but one named after the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. And I think that's just representative of how much my grandparents really wanted to be in America, really wanted to be Americans. My dad was born the day after Lincoln's birthday on February 13th, and the day before Valentine's Day. So he always used to say, "I'm so glad my parents didn't name me Valentine," right? That would have been horrible, but instead he got the name Lincoln. My dad also has something else in common with another president of the United States. He was struck by polio as a young boy, just like FDR was. FDR was more like in his early 30s, or maybe he was 39, but he was in his 30s. And my dad did survive, but he did always suffer with a deformed foot and a limp. So he wasn't eligible for the military or anything like that, but during his high school years, he did participate in sports to the best he could, in baseball and things like that, but he always did suffer from that polio when he was a child. The other kind of interesting thing about my dad was when he was around 10 years old, he actually owned land. And you go, how can that be possible? Well, when they leased the farm, the woman they leased it to, she ended up passing away. And in her will, she gave first right of refusal for my grandfather and my dad to buy the farm. And that was just really a huge opportunity that she would do this to immigrants. My grandfather didn't even speak really good English, but somehow she gave him that opportunity. And so to take advantage of that, my dad, my grandfather, knew of an older Japanese Nisei, which is second generation, born in America. And he became my dad's guardian legally because the alien land laws would not allow for my grandfather to own land. So my dad at probably around 10 years old, was actually the legal owner of this farm because of this guardian that stood in for him. So that comes into play as we go through the story. So life before World War II. This is a family picture. They probably all went to LA. They have this picture, all dressed up, grandma, grandpa, my Uncle Salo in the middle, my dad on the left. My two young aunts here, they're 13 years younger than my dad, but they're a twin, Kazi and Aki. And to the left is my grandfather's stepmother. His father had passed, but his mother had passed quite when he was only about 20. His father remarried, and this was his widow, his father's widow. But, so this is, they're all standing there with twins, have the matching dresses, and the picture on the right I really like a lot. This is my grandmother with her two daughters, and I don't know how well you can see, but the two aunties have on Japanese kimonos, holding American baby dolls. And I think, to me, this picture shows kind of what this was like. Immigrants who really wanted to live in America, wanted the American life and opportunity, but also holding on to some of their culture, as in the Japanese kimonos. But knowing my aunts, they had to get all the dolls and say, we have to hold our dolls in this picture. And so, and I think sort of this is also kind of neat because Japanese Girls' Day was March 3rd, and International Women's Day was just earlier this week. But all of this would change, and I'm sure all of you know, World War II was raging on in all parts of the world, and then Japan bombs Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. My dad was just about 19 years old, and he remembers that he was out picking cabbage, and somebody drove by yelling really mean racial slurs at him, and he wasn't quite sure why. And then when they went in for lunch, they had heard that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. So very confusing, lots of chaos, not knowing what does this mean. We're Japanese heritage, but he's an American-born citizen by birth. And so what does that mean? What's the future gonna hold? So these months were very, very tense. I'm sure there was a lot of newspapers, radio talking about what could happen. And what did happen on February 19th was Executive Order 9066 was signed by President Roosevelt. And this essentially said that if you're a Japanese heritage along the West Coast, so Washington, Oregon, Los Angeles, that you are going to be evacuated. And I think terminology is really interesting here because the words they used then do change and the meanings are different. And now we use evacuating as wildfires or if there's a flood or a hurricane, right? But this was the terminology that they used, that we were going to evacuate Japanese from their homes, their businesses, from school, whatever their livelihood, into high desert or remote camps for the sake of national security. So a couple months go by, and they start to realize what this means. On May 14th of that same year, my grandfather, who is in the top right corner at the last row, he was arrested by the FBI at the Westminster farm. And because of his, to some degree, leadership, but his participation in a couple of Japanese community things, they accused him of being a spy. Now, some of you might have remembered that, because I know I have some family friends out there. You might remember my grandfather, but I mean, there is just like, he had no character to be a spy. That was just not in his character at all. But because he was the secretary of the Garden Grove Japanese School, it was a language school for young children, and I went to it when I was a kid, but even before that, they wanted their younger children to be able to communicate in Japanese, and so he was part of that. And the other thing he was involved in is called the Kochiken Club. And Japan is made up of prefectures, kind of like what we would call state, And Kochi is one of the prefectures. So everybody who came from Kochi, when they came to America, they still wanted to have that connection, right, to their homeland. It would be like if we all moved to Japan, and we said, oh, Diane's from California, oh, you know, Chris is from California, let's get up and have a club together. That's the kind of club it was. So they celebrated New Year's together, they had summer picnics together, but very much social and family oriented. But those two things made the government suspicious of my grandfather. These other men, I don't know what their backgrounds are, but probably likely they were involved in something as well. I'll just say right now that through all the history and interrogations and things like that, there was never any evidence found that any of the Japanese living in America were spies or were dealing with Japan. So these are very unwarranted accusations. 3 days later, the rest of the family is going to leave for Poston, Arizona. And Poston is right across the California-Arizona border, south of Parker. Now, this is where our story gets really interesting, I think. There's my grandmother, and then my Uncle Salo, my dad, Tad, on the right, and the two young aunts. Well, and actually, they actually didn't arrive all together. You'll see that I put family 24132 and family 20344 A and B. My aunts had chickenpox at that time. And so one of them was actually at home sick when the FBI came for my grandfather. The other one kind of got sick later, but both of them had chickenpox. They were not allowed to go into the camp. So my grandmother had to leave her two twin daughters, who at that time were like 7 years old, and leave them at the hospital under the care of the nurses at the hospital, and then get on the train with her two sons and go to camp. So in 3 days, she lost her husband and her two twin daughters. And I don't know, but I just have a lot more respect for the resilience of my grandmother and what she went through at that time. So my aunties would say they got to go to the hospital, they got to have popsicles. I think it was very much a blessing that there were two of them. I don't know what would have happened if it was just one aunt left all by herself, but because there were two of them, they sort of just said, wow, this is an adventure, you know. And I said to my aunt, I said, didn't you ever wonder why Grandma didn't come and visit you? And she goes, oh no, we thought when we got spots that you went to the hospital and no one could see us because we have spots. So, you know, they kind of worked it into kind of like when you're a child, you're like, oh, okay, we've never been to the hospital before. But they would say, one of them, the one on the right is Aki. She said, you know, first time when she got scared was when the nurse took them on the train to go, once they were healed, back to the camp. And she saw, I said, didn't you ever wonder you drove to the hospital in a car, and now you're getting on a train? And she goes, no, you're just excited to go on a train. So I mean, and they're kind of, these two aunts are really a lot of fun, so I kind of could see that. But I said, didn't you kind of wonder? She goes, I wasn't scared until I saw, we were pulling up, the train was pulling up to the dock, the platform, and she said, I saw my mother and she was crying. She goes, that's when I first realized something was wrong. And I could just imagine my grandmother, you know, this is probably a couple weeks later, and now her babies are coming back. And so that's something, I think our family is probably one of the few that has two family numbers, and the second group of family members is two little 7-year-old girls. They're also, I call it a brave photo for Seima because they're smiling, but this photo was obviously sent to my grandfather to say, hey, we're okay. We're together, we're okay. A little about the camps. I could tell you a lot more, but just really briefly, approximately 120,000 Chinese who live in Washington, Oregon, and California lost their freedom and were sent to an incarceration camp. And I think here in California, probably many of you have heard of Manzanar, driven past it. Tule Lake is more north of that. Colorado River, which is Poston, Gila River, Topaz, Granada, Minidoka in Idaho, Hart Mountain in Wyoming, and a lot of people are really surprised that there were actually two in Arkansas. But these are the relative numbers. interesting, I don't know about the others so much, but when you get 18,000 people, this is a pretty sizable, even 10,000 people back in the 1940s in these areas was a pretty large group of people. And this made post in the third largest city in Arizona after Phoenix and Tucson. These were dry, hot, dry in the summer, 120 degrees, cold, 30 degrees in barracks. Japanese are very modest, and for the most part, at least at this time, and the showers and the latrines were not private. There were men's and women's, but within that, there was no privacy there. They ate camp and mess, or the camp's mess halls, served food that they really weren't used to. One of my aunts said that she could not stand the sight of curry because they served a lot of it and it wasn't good. And this is funny because this aunt eats almost everything. That's one of her really bad memories is curry. She just told me that, I didn't know that. Because she does eat everything. But I think when you start to think of relocating 120,000 people from their homes, their businesses, the schools, if students were in college, they had to leave their colleges. And then there were some people who had jobs within, let's say, at a state office or government office, they were released from their jobs because they were Japanese. My family didn't have, I mean, there was what I would say abusive words and things like that, but in some areas of California, it was really bad. And people really did have to fear for their lives if they were Japanese because of the racial bias during this time. So what do we do with the farm? The farm's 40 acres. Has a farmhouse, a barn, workers' cottages, tractors, all of this stuff. So now my dad, who had just turned 20, has to figure out, what do you do with the farm? The other farmers were mostly Japanese, so it wasn't like there was a lot of farmers who could take on more. And thanks to Frank Monroe, this is where Mr. Frank Monroe, who was the banker in Garden Grove on Main Street at the First National Bank, plays a major role in our story. He was my dad's banker, and not only that, he actually, I would say, mentored my dad from the time he was 8 or 9 years old in banking and business. And so he was a dear friend. He was a mentor to my dad. He also was the banker for Mr. Gonzalo and Felicitas Mendez. And so he would actually go to their cantina to make a deposit and deposit in the bank so Gonzalo wouldn't have to leave his restaurant, right? Because he's busy serving. And so Frank was not just any old banker. This guy was pretty awesome. My dad always said he was the best friend he could ever have. Not a prejudiced bone in his body. But thanks to Mr. Monroe, he decided and convinced my dad, let's lease the farm. Let's try to see if we can find someone to lease it to. We think the war will end, which is a pretty bold statement when the whole world is at war, to say, I think it will end. Let's ride this out. And so Frank Monroe talked to Gonzalo and said, Gonzalo, you always wanted to farm again. You wanted to be the boss. And he's like, yeah. He goes, I have a ready-made, move-in ready farm for you. What do you think? And so he and Felicitas closed the cantina. They leased their home in Santa Ana and they moved to Westminster. Meanwhile, that gives our family hope that they still have a home. It basically secured the home for the future. And here's one of my kindnesses statements. Kindness is collaboration and building trusted friendships. And I think that's what our story is really about, is the collaboration between a lot of different people. But this is one of the key ones. And this is a picture of the two leases. They're in the Chapman archives if you are interested in more detail. But I didn't know we had these, and I found them tucked away in our farm office desk when I was cleaning it out. And I thought, this might be interesting for the future, and kind of tossed it to the side. And then I went back and wait a second. So it's actually really interesting. It details what Gonzalo actually leased, down to tractors and discs and farm equipment. So when the Mendezes moved from Santa Ana, where they went to a barrio school, but the barrio school taught English and math and science and history. The academics were essentially the same as the white school. But when they moved to Westminster, they cannot enroll. Because when they went there, because of the color of their skin and their last name, they were denied entrance into 17th Street School. Their only option was Hoover Street School, which was not the same academics. In fact, they weren't any academics. They were teaching kids to learn English. They were, Sylvia says, I felt like they were teaching me how to be a maid or a servant, or my brother's a gardener, or just laborers without any academics. And this is a picture, the Mendez kids are not in this picture, but this is a picture of all the Mexican children at Hoover Street School. And Sylvia, this is Sylvia about age 10. And this is where we come to this concept that separate is not, that because they're separate, segregated schools, but yet not equal education, this plays a huge role as we get further into the legal case. So Gonzalo, he starts talking to other families, other Mexican-American families in Orange County, and finds that other people are having the same problem. Their children speak English, they're very much capable of much more rigorous academics, and they are in Mexican, quote-unquote, schools without the opportunity for a good education. So he talks to a lot of people, and somebody brings up the fact that there's a Mr. David Marcus, an attorney, who happens to be Jewish, but works for the Mexican consulate, and he speaks Spanish. His wife is actually from Mexico, and he speaks Spanish. So he talks to Mr. Marcus, and he decides to hire him to take up this case. Marcus had been pretty successful. I think he had won before this a case in San Bernardino where Mexicans were being discriminated against, and Gonzalo gives him $500 out of the asparagus crop profits to fight this case to start. And that was the beginning. There were other payments he made, but at the very beginning, that's what he did. They continue to talk, and they find 4 other families, Palomino, Ramirez, Estrada, and Guzman families from other school districts in Orange County, and together those 5 families set up the Mendez et al. Versus Westminster et al. Lawsuit. This case involves Westminster School District, Santa Ana, Garden Grove, and El Medina. So these families basically are leading now a class action lawsuit for about 5,000 Mexican American students at that time in Orange County. Marcus is really smart. He makes a couple of key decisions, and the 2 that I'll note is he decides not to go to California State Court. He goes to the federal court. One reason is he thinks if they win, they're going to have more impact across the whole United States for all Mexican children, but for all children of color, really. The other thing is at that time there was a California law that already said that it was okay to have segregated schools for Asians and Native Americans. And he feared that if he just went to the state court, they'll say, well, we're just going to add Mexicans to that list, and it would have totally defeated their case. So by going to federal court, he felt like he had a better chance because he based it on the fact. This was not a fact, a race issue case. This was citizens being unequally treated was the foundation of this case. So white versus Mexican students, all of them were born in the United States. They were all citizens, but they were being unequally treated. And his case was founded on the fact that this violated the protection clause in the 14th Amendment. So those 2 facts, there's some other things, but I think those are kind of the 2 critical things that make this case different. There were other cases going on in other parts of the state too. But I think Mr. Marcus was very wise in choosing the federal court and also choosing the Equal Protection Clause. So, meanwhile, Mendez and Marcus are going to Oliva County getting evidence, talking to people. And I want to say one thing too, I have this in the book, but Mr. Mendez, he went to the school to try to work this out. They said no, only option is the Mexican school, Hoover Street School. He went to the school district, he went to the school superintendent. So he had been talking all along the line to people to try to resolve this without going to court. And finally, there was no other option. But he was really adamant that this was not going to happen, that his children and the other Mexican children should have the equal opportunity for education. And so I think these 5 families really, the kindness that I saw here is the courage to stand for what is fair and just for all. There was a point in the history where Westminster went to Mr. Mendez and said, hey, if you don't do the suit, we'll just let your kids in. And he's like, no. This is for all the kids, not just mine. What about the other kids in the other school districts? So I think he was very much fighting for something much larger than just for his 3 children. And other families did the same. David Marcus files in Los Angeles at the U.S. District, the Federal District Court on March 2nd of 1945, and the trial was July 5th through 11th with Judge Paul McCormick. Sylvia remembers, one, that it was summer vacation, and instead they had to get dressed up and go to the court. But she also remembers being kind of scared, because she was only 10 years old. And here she's going to court, all the parents with their children, she with her brothers and her parents are all going to LA, and we didn't have the 5 freeway every day for 6 days to be in the court. And she said, I was so scared I would have to talk. If I were 10 years old in a federal court, I'd be totally terrified too. She wasn't called to testify, but her parents were, the other parents were. And Mr. Marcus did some really interesting things because he went to sociologists to ask, what is the effect of segregation on young children? And the responses were things like, well, they feel like they can't compete, they feel like they're left out, it isn't a good thing sociologically. And so he brought in scientific behavioral sciences into this court case as well. I think the other interesting thing, if you look at the date, in 1945 in that summer, the war was starting to wane. And in August, just a few weeks after this, the U.S. bombs Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, which brings Japan to surrender. Unfortunately, it was after hundreds of thousands of people were either killed or severely hurt by the atomic bombs. But this is right in the midst of when World War II is coming to a conclusion and the case is open. Now, Judge McCormick, I don't know, but everything I've read about him, he was a real man of integrity. And he wasn't going to make a quick decision. He really wanted to study this. In fact, it took him 7 months to rule on this. Meanwhile, the war ends, and another key kindness comes up. And this one's kind of a fun part of our story. Kindness is collaborating together for a win-win solution. So here's Mr. Mendez in the middle of this court case. He's living on the farm. His house is rented out in Santa Ana to somebody else. My parents, my dad, grandfather, they're coming back from camp and where to live. So they decide they're going to live in one of the 4 workers' cottages. And my grandfather invited some family friends to come who had no place to go to live in the other cottages on the farm. And my dad and grandfather actually worked for Gonzalo for regular wages, while Gonzalo leased the farm from them. So it's a real story of trading places, that idea of basically the owner of the farm is working for the guy who leased the farm. But this allowed Gonzalo, one, to get through that law case. It also gave him the profits from the asparagus farm to be able to then start his next cantina. And I think from my grandfather and dad's point of view, they're just happy to be home. They're just happy to be back home with the farm. This living on the farm together lasted about a year. And that's where my young aunts Kazi and Aki played with Sylvia. So if any of you know that book, Sylvia and Aki, it's a fictional story, but it's about Aki and Sylvia and their little friendship. It's based on the truth, but it is fiction. But it's a great little book for about 4th grade children to read about parts of this story. So this was living on the farm together. And then a few months later, 7 months after the trial, but at the beginning of 1946, Judge Paul McCormick ruled in favor of the families. So they won. So this was huge because Judge McCormick says, a paramount requisite in the American system of public education is social equality. It must be open to all children regardless of lineage. And this was a major victory. But not all the school districts agreed. So Westminster agreed, and they let the Mendez children go to 17th Street School. But the other 3 school districts appealed it. And so not all the families' kids could go, just the ones in Westminster. But for Sylvia, McDonald, and Jerome, this was a big win because all the kids that they played with in the neighborhood on the farm, they already knew these kids. They just couldn't go to the same school with them. And Sylvia said it was so much fun going on the bus and getting off and going into the classroom together. The school that had good education, all those subjects that she wanted to study. Plus, it had a safe playground and monkey bars. Hoover Street School, I might have not said this, but Hoover Street School had no playground. And it was next to a cow pasture that had an electric fence to keep the cows away. But if kids weren't careful, those kids were running into that electric fence. So you could really tell that it was just not thinking of the kids' future at all. It was a horrible school. But Sylvia would talk about how much fun it was to have recess and have monkey bars. And when you're 10, this is all you want, right? And real subjects, real students, learning, being challenged. So just a bit about the appeal case. For the other school districts, in December of that year, the case got tried before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And then right after, in 1947, the state government was obviously watching this because the Anderson bill was introduced to the state assembly and state senate to end segregated schools in California. So this is really overlapping in this case. April 14th, in just a few weeks, it's the 75th anniversary of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upholding Judge McCormick's ruling saying that segregated schools in school districts are no longer illegal. And then by June of that year, both the Senate and the Assembly in our state of California passed the Anderson bill, which desegregates our California state schools, 7 years before Brown versus Education. One thing that's really interesting about this is we have a lot of different people from very different cultural backgrounds all in this story, Mexicans, Japanese, a Jewish attorney, a white banker, and now we also have Native Americans. Poston, this particular internment camp, the government put it right in the middle of the Colorado River Indian Tribe Reservation. When they said they were going to do that, the tribal leaders said, no, you're not. We don't believe in this, we don't want any part of it. But the government overruled them, and so Poston Camp 1, 2, and 3, these 17,000, almost 18,000 people were moved in right smack dab in the middle of this reservation. The Hopi, the Mojave Indians, the Navajo, and the Chemehuevi, those 4 tribes still live there. And I think it was the mid-1980s, 1985, my parents went to one of the very first pilgrimages back to Poston, and it was hosted by the Indian tribe, a local church there, and a Japanese organization. And about 250 people went. It was a pretty big group of people, and they went, and my mother came back and just raved about the hospitality of the Native Americans. And these are people they've never met, but they have a shared history in this land. And what the Japanese brought to that part of Arizona was figuring out how to grow things in the desert. So if you go there, there's agricultural fields, there's corporate farms. It's actually, for one of the reservations, it's actually rather prosperous because the Japanese figured out how to take water from the Colorado River and grow things in the desert wasteland. And actually, they're having another pilgrimage in, I think it's end of September this year. So I'll be going. I've been to Poston once years ago. I haven't been recently, but I'll be going to see the sites. And the reservation, it's called Colorado River Indian Tribe Crit. They donated land, and the Japanese raised money to build a posted memorial on that land. So if you were to drive through there on your way to Parker, that would be something you'd see. But the kindness I see here is remembering what others have suffered with compassion and hospitality, even when you have suffered far worse. And I think we could all agree the Native Americans, their history is very sad. How they've been treated and what has happened into their lands. But yet, they welcomed our Japanese families back with hospitality. So kindness is sacrificing for the good of others. And here, I don't think I could have written a story like this that includes so many different cultures and so many different nationalities of people, where Japanese Americans are incarcerated, but yet men and women, Japanese men and women served and fought in World War II. Mexican Americans' families were denied a good education, yet they fought for equal education. A white banker rose up against racism to serve his customers of color, Mr. Mendez and my dad. A Jewish attorney fights for, and a Catholic judge upholds the Equal Protection Clause for all citizens, even young students. And then Black attorneys from the NAACP, a very young Robert Carter and a very young Thurgood Marshall, wrote the amicus brief in support of the appeal process for Mendez versus Westminster. And as I mentioned, the Colorado River Indian Tribe and Japanese Americans are jointly holding the Poston story to preserve this history, this joint history we have. A grateful arigato to Orange County, May 1970. This is something, things pop up as I'm writing in this book, and my dad, I remember when I think I was in like 7th or 8th grade, he said, okay, we gotta send out all these letters, and what they were doing is raising $50,000 to build this Japanese garden on the side of the courthouse in Santa Ana. And I don't know if any of you have seen that. It's just, in 2020, it was its 50th anniversary. But this is a picture that my dad took way back in 1970. But he, this group of Japanese American community services group raised $50,000 to build this. And I think it's really interesting what the plaque says. Dedicated and presented for the pleasure of all people in Orange County by the Japanese American community. A grateful arigato in honor of our pioneer fathers and for the blessings of freedom. May 27, 1970. And that's approximately 25 years after to the month that they had left for the camp. There are places in California and there are places in the West Coast that actually voted that the Japanese could not go back to where they were from. So there were many people who didn't have a physical home, but they weren't even wanted to come back. I think this is a sign. It doesn't even say anything about the camp. It doesn't say anything about the internment. But I think what my father and his friends and others in the Japanese community at that time were saying is, thank you for letting us come back. Thank you that we could come back to our homes. And so if you're ever at the courthouse, on that tall building, go around the sides. They just renovated the garden. It's really a lovely, serene place in the midst of the Civic Center there. And then lastly, we're celebrating the 75th anniversary. This story happened right here. If you live close to Westminster or Garden Grove, it's right there. Hopefully this year, I'm not quite sure yet of the date, but the city of Westminster has created a freedom trail. It's about a 2-mile walking bike trail, as well as a little Mendez tribute park at the corner of, it's right off, I think it's Olive and 17th.
Westminster and Olive?
Yeah. And it was dedicated the groundbreaking was during COVID, but hopefully, I haven't heard the date yet, but you might be hearing of the opening of that, the grand opening. But the Freedom Trail, actually, the Orange County Department of Education has actually created panels that talk about the freedom and the Bill of Rights for the whole United States, including the Mendez story. So it's a great field trip, it's a great place to come, and then also to remember part of our history. So kindness is respecting our differences, celebrating shared history, and moving forward as one humanity. So thank you for your interest in this story. I hope you learned something, or maybe a different perspective on something that you heard. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Yes?
What kind of produce was grown on the farm?
When Mr. Mendez was there, it was asparagus, but cabbage, a lot of different vegetables. My grandfather having gone through the Depression, my grandfather said, if you can't eat it, don't grow it. But when I was born in the 1950s on, it was mostly strawberries, tomatoes, beans. We did grow asparagus too.
What was the label on the side of the crate?
Oh, a couple different ones. Strawberries, mostly I remember Cal Fruit.
What was the name of the farm?
Munemitsu Farms. Really creative, right? and we actually shipped for different people, so that's why, but most of them were Cal Fruit. But I remember some of our fruit went to, what do you call it? Currants at the end of the season. Things would go to Currants. Tomatoes
I
went
used to
to.
work for an agricultural trade association, so they could have been members of Western Growers a long time ago.
Probably. I know that name.
Oh, you know? Yeah.
We had tomatoes, end of the season, the tomatoes went to Hunts, if any of you from Fullerton area, to Hunt Weston.
Okay, and then also, when the Native Americans, they were kicked off the reservation for the Japanese U.S. citizens to come in, where did the Native Americans go?
This is a huge reservation, right?
Oh,
So
they
they
shared
actually
it?
were living in different parts of it, but the center of it was very undeveloped. And the government had a strategy to this though, because the Japanese brought in, they started to work. They had to do something right. And so roads, electricity, a lot of infrastructure was brought into the center of that reservation. But the other tribes were still there, but in different parts. And I think it was mostly the Mojave and the Navajo were already there. In the book, there's a story about, I think it's the Hopi tribe. They came in September of 1945 as the Japanese had left. There were still a few, but most had left. And they were expecting to come to a barren wasteland, and they're like, oh my gosh, there is a Japanese garden here. There are houses, they've left sheets, they've left bedding, and so they were able to take some of those. In my book, I refer to a website for the Colorado River Indian Tribe. They have a really good film that talks about what was left when they came. And apparently, I haven't seen this personally, but apparently, some of those barracks were cut in half, and one of the Hopi, I don't know if he's Hopi, he's part of the Crit tribe. He said he wondered when he was a young kid why all of our houses look the same. And his dad said, well, that's because they're all barracks. They were Japanese where the Japanese Americans were barracks, but they cut them in half and moved them. And so apparently, if you go in that area, you can see some of these older buildings.
Did some of your ancestors live on Terminal Island or Terminal Island? Because I know
No.
that was a big, you know.
That was a really devastating, the fishermen of Terminal Island. No, I don't know that we had, direct personal friends that were there, but I have read the story of all the fishermen. They were taken, because they were right at the port, they were taken very early.
Yeah.
I think most of them went to Santa Anita and lived in
Yeah,
the
so
hostels.
turn that into like a assembly, a holding tank before.
Yeah, an assembly center.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Do we know how long the farm nobody was there after the folks were sent to the camps? Do we know how long it was by itself before Mr. Mendez?
Leased it. Yeah, that's a good question. So the written leases actually start in 1944. But Sylvia remembers being there for her birthday, which is in May. So that was before the leases. So I think there was probably like a gentleman's handshake. And of course it would take Mr. Mendez some time to lease his house, close down his restaurant. So I don't know the actual timing of when Mendez came to Westminster, but it was before the lease started because Sylvia says, I know my birthday, my 8th birthday was on that farm. So that's a good question. I don't know.
The reason I ask is because when I was kindergarten, I was in public school in kindergarten,
Oh, wow.
1941.
Mhm.
And then I had a little friend that lived on the farm with his parents. I believe it was before Mr. Mendez arrived there.
Mhm.
And we used to go there. My mom and dad had a friend named Francisco Avila, who lived on the farm. So we would go on Sundays and visit. You know, my mom was a godparent to one of their children, Avila children. And so we'd go there and just play around the barn.
Yeah.
No,
Did that
I-
garden look familiar?
Barn, oh yes,
Yeah.
I remember that barn, yeah. Anyway, so that's what I've been curious all these years.
Yeah.
Was Mr. Avila there before Mr. Mendez?
I don't know. I mean, we had.
I've never heard that
Well,
before.
when I say we, my dad had workers living in those
But they didn't live there,
cottages.
and not on the house.
They lived in those 4 cottages on the property. So it could be, I don't know what happened between May of 1942 and them showing up sometime in 1944.
Mhm.
We kind of suspect that there was like a gentleman's handshake and there might have been someone else who was kind of watching over it.
And Mr. Avila was there, yeah.
Mhm.
'Cause I remember
That's
going there.
interesting.
Yeah.
Is he or his family still living, Mr. Avila?
Only person I know of that is still alive is one Mr. Avila's daughters. And my wife and I went to visit a few years ago. She lives in Santa Ana. But other than that, I don't know anyone. Because I was interested coming here today because a lot of people are gone.
Yeah. Well, here's the other thing, is there could have been a gentleman's handshake on this thing, because Sylvia's mother, who I never met her, but Sylvia's mother said that they drove out to Poston to have the papers signed.
I've heard that.
Yeah, and if you look real closely at that first lease, Gonzalo Mendez's name is totally misspelled. Has Mendez instead of Mendez or something. And so it looks like it was done very quickly, and it could have been even typed at the camp
Mhm.
or something. But, you know, back then, I mean, if your friend said, this is a man you can trust, Tad, you can trust Gonzalo, you can trust Tad, it's very likely they had some kind of handshake on it.
Yeah.
But my dad never mentioned leasing it to anyone else in the interim.
In fact, yeah, I've always been curious about that.
Yeah.
because I was
If
living
you
there.
find out more about that, I'd love to know,
So-
because I don't know, and Sylvia doesn't know either. And, because you gotta remember, Sylvia was 8 years old,
Yeah.
right, when all this was happening. So a lot of the background on it is stuff her mother told her, and then she relayed it to me.
Yeah, Silva was my classmate in Hoover School.
Oh, really?
Kindergarten, first grade, yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. I'll have to get your name and tell her I met you. Yeah,
Yeah, Frank Mendoza.
Frank Mendoza.
Yeah, she knows, I've seen her in some of her speeches and stuff. So
Yeah, she's really busy now.
she'll remember. Yeah.
Super busy.
Excuse me,
Sure.
I heard you mention Hoover Street School. There wasn't any Hoover Street at the time this happened. All the streets in Old Westminster were named trees.
Eucalyptus.
Oak Street where Hoover Street
Eucalyptus.
is now.
Yeah, it was eucalyptus.
Well, maybe I
But the
could.
school
It's
probably
called Hoover
was there
School.
before the street, and the street was named
Named
for
later.
an honor school. It's very, only a block away.
Yeah, yeah, thank you for that correction.
It could have been named after President Hoover.
It wasn't.
No, the school wasn't named for Hoover.
The street wasn't either.
Where's the location of your family's farm?
It's on Edward Street in Westminster. If you drive by right now, you'll see a Johnson and Finley School. So what's interesting is that 40 acres became two public schools, an elementary and a junior high right next door.
So it was sold years, obviously years ago.
It sold, well, it was actually, taken for the schools by eminent domain when my grandfather and my dad owned it. Or actually, my dad owned it, but we think of it as grandpa owned it too. So it was taken, that 40 acres was taken by eminent domain, and then, my dad and grandfather moved to Garden Grove to farm. Thank you.
Just a quick comment and then a question. I was struck by the comment in your book that the history of the camps was excluded from the state California textbooks for almost 40 years. And the reason that struck me is because I've been attending school board meetings in Central Linda, and we happen to have that rebel element that has infiltrated our district that wants to control what kind of history is or isn't taught. If you've heard plenty of news about that, and it's there. So I really appreciated your book. I just loved it, and I think it's so important that the history not be forgot again or excluded again. But we're seeing different events. You know, they really won't downplay the civil rights movement. You've heard you've heard the news. But just to say that I think this is a really wonderful, important book, and I am going to share this with a lot of people that I know that are educators. I have a real quick question. When did you meet Sylvia? You were much younger. You didn't know her when you were on the farm.
No,
so-
and that was a totally, when you pick up the phone call, and it's like, I don't know who this is, hello. Sandra Roby, who was the executive producer of the Mendez versus Westminster documentary about 20 years ago, she called me and said, are you Janice? Or no, are you the Munemitsu that used to farm in Westminster during World War II? And I said, well, my dad and grandfather did it.
Right.
And she was just gonna do the film, the documentary, and she said, would you like to come meet Sylvia? So that was 20 years ago, this October, November, this fall. So I just met Sylvia 20 years ago.
Okay, so how much difference is there in your age then?
About 20 years.
Yeah. Okay, I
Yeah,
kind of
my
put that
aunts
together,
are,
but I found that kind of.
my aunts are 86 and Sylvia is 85. And I'll be 65 this year.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have two questions. When we know that there were a lot of arrests made on December 8th, immediately after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, of Japanese Americans living in those communities, was it a surprise to your father that he was arrested so late after so many of the community members had already been arrested and interrogated?
I don't know. I suspect they were concerned about it. I think a lot of those arrests were where the Japanese were populated along the coast and near major strategic, like military or ports, like the Terminal Island
Okay.
fishermen.
Because there were also several in Wintersburg
Oh, there
and
was
Garden
a-
Grove. Yeah. Yeah.
It may have depended on how visible the
Okay.
Japanese were.
Okay.
And maybe my grandfather was kind of like, okay, Japanese school,
Yeah.
Kochiken Club, but there might have been other people who were much more prominent in the county. I'm not aware of their stores specifically.
Okay. And then how long was he under arrest before he was reunited with his family?
He was reunited after about 2.5 years.
Oh, wow.
But he went from New Mexico, he was in New Mexico for quite a long time. I'd have to look the dates up for you, but he was in New Mexico and then he got released, but he was still on parole. And he went to Colorado and worked with, Colorado, and worked with my dad. My dad had, there's something called indefinite leave. So the mostly younger Japanese could take advantage of that and go and work somewhere, but away from the West Coast.
Right.
So my dad was working in Colorado, and Grandpa went there for 6 months, but then he ended up going to Houston, probably, I think it was around maybe 4 or 5 months before they were able to leave. So, but it was, he didn't see my grandmother for 2.5 years, and the girls. And I asked my aunt, I'm like, what did you wonder about where Grandpa was? And she goes, our mom just said, because they think your grandfather, your dad, is an important man, he's in another camp somewhere else. So of course my aunts went, well, our dad is important. I mean, really, if you knew my aunts, it's pretty much what they said. But I think, again, my grandmother and my dad, they tried to protect the two girls, the younger children. And there's actually a Chapman University cinema student is doing a very short film on my aunts and their experience at Poston. So his name is Brendan Boubion. He has a film that just got into a film festival this month in San Diego. So I guess he's very good, but he wanted to do this, so we'll see what happens. But it talks about these two twin girls and their experience in the camps. Well, thank you. Any other questions? Oh,
I didn't get the name of the property owner of the farm who was leasing to your grandfather.
I don't have that. I
Okay.
could probably find it, but I have to.
We'll
Yeah.
look for it. We'll
But it
look for
was a woman. Yeah.
I'll
I guess-
email it to you.
Okay. You could go to the San Ana office and look for that, yeah.
Thanks.
But that's what she did. And it's interesting that, I was talking to a friend who's a flower grower, and he's Mexican, and he says, you know what? This Italian man helped his dad start growing flowers in San Diego. I mean, he just said, hey, you wanna try it? Try growing your flowers here on my property, and you can pay me out the first crop. You can give me a deposit for this land in the 1950s. So, I mean, that just shows the generosity of people and what can happen, because now his father was a flower grower, he and his wife are flower growers, his daughter may continue that. But they had that opportunity to own land as well. So I think there are a lot of stories like that out there. It'd be great to uncover them. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
Remember Jane Gerber?
Thank you all for coming this evening.
And if you'd like a
She lived on
person,
Edwards in that old house.
Yes, our thanks to our speaker, and
She was a member of this.
please help yourself to refreshments in the back, and we will see you all next month.
Thank you. Very good show.